I was alone in the observation tower when the forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. A difference every ranger learns to recognize. Quiet is natural. Wind through Douglas firs. The distant call of a Steller's jay. Water moving over stone. Silence is wrong. It means every living thing within earshot has stopped breathing, stopped moving, frozen in collective dread. I'd been working the Olympic National Park backcountry for 17 years. I knew these mountains like the scar tissue on my hands. Knew how morning fog moved through the valleys, how elk migrations followed the ancient paths, how the old-growth groves held their own microclimates. I'd seen black bears, cougars, even tracked what I thought were wolf prints where wolves weren't supposed to be. But I'd never felt the forest hold its breath like this. It was 11:47 p.m. on September 23rd. I remember because I checked my watch twice, the digital numbers glowing green in the darkness of the tower. Outside, the September moon hung fat and yellow over the Hoh rainforest canopy. 78 degrees at midnight. Climate data I'd been logging showed the warming trend, the slow unraveling of familiar patterns. The silence started at the tree line, maybe 200 yards north, spread like a shockwave through the understory. I could track its movement by watching the forest go still, sector by sector, as if something massive was moving beneath the canopy. Something that made every creature choose invisibility over flight. I killed my flashlight, lifted the binoculars with hands that had started to shake. That's when I saw the light. Not a headlamp, not a campfire, not any light source I recognized. It pulsed between the trees like bioluminescence, pale blue-white, moving with purpose through terrain no human could navigate in darkness. It didn't illuminate the forest around it. The light seemed to exist independent of the physical world, passing through trunks and ferns without casting shadows. I should have radioed the main station, should have followed protocol, logged the anomaly, requested backup. Instead, I grabbed my field pack and started down the tower stairs. Because 17 years in these mountains had taught me one thing. Some truths don't wait for authorization. The descent took 40 minutes through Douglas fir and western hemlock that had been growing since before America had a name. My headlamp carved a narrow tunnel through darkness, so complete it felt physical. I moved by memory and topography, following ridgelines I'd mapped in daylight, using game trails beaten down by centuries of elk and deer. The forest had started breathing again. Tentative. A distant owl called twice, then fell silent. Something small moved through the salal and Oregon grape to my left. The ecosystem reassembling itself around whatever had passed through, but the wrongness remained. I'd studied forestry at Oregon State, spent summers working fire watch in the Cascades, learned to read landscapes the way some people read faces. This forest was lying. The spacing of sounds was off. The smell was wrong. Ozone and metal, sharp and chemical, cutting through the usual perfume of decaying wood and moss. The temperature kept shifting, pockets of warmth and cold that had nothing to do with elevation or drainage patterns. At 12:33 a.m., I found the first physical evidence. A clearing I'd never seen before, roughly circular, maybe 40 feet across. The understory had been pressed flat. Not burned, not broken, but compressed with such force that ferns and huckleberry bushes lay woven into the forest floor like carpet. No debris, no disturbance beyond the perimeter. Just perfect, impossible flatness. I knelt at the edge, pulled off a glove, touched the compressed vegetation, still warm. The moss held the imprint of something geometric, patterns too regular to be natural. Hexagons within hexagons, each about the size of my palm, covering the entire clearing in tessellating precision. My radio crackled. Static, but underneath it, something else. A rhythm. Almost like speech, but the intervals were wrong, the frequencies too high and too low simultaneously. I turned the radio off. Whatever this was, I needed to understand it before I tried to explain it. The second clearing appeared 200 yards northwest. Larger. The same hexagonal impressions, but here the trees at the perimeter showed damage. Not broken. Transformed. The bark had been altered at a molecular level, turned smooth and reflective, like the trees had been partially converted into metal. When I touched the surface, it was cold despite the warm night, and it hummed with a frequency I felt in my teeth. I took samples, photographs, collected readings on my handheld GPS that made no sense. The coordinates kept shifting, placing me in locations separated by miles, then snapping back to probable positions. The compass spun without settling. Magnetic north had become a suggestion. The third clearing held the craft. I use that word carefully. Not ship, not vessel. Those terms imply something we understand. This was geometry made physical. A structure roughly 30 feet across, hovering 18 inches above the forest floor without sound, without visible propulsion. Its surface wasn't solid in any conventional sense. It seemed to exist in layers, each one slightly out of phase with the others, creating a shimmer effect like heat haze made solid. The light I'd seen from the tower emanated from within the structure, pulsing in patterns that hurt to watch directly. Not because they were bright, but because they contained information my brain tried to process and failed. Each pulse felt like a word in a language that bypassed conscious thought, speaking directly to something deeper. I approached slowly. Each step felt like moving through resistance, like the air itself was trying to turn me back. Not hostile, protective, the way a body surrounds a wound. At 15 feet, I heard the voice. Not in my ears, in my chest, vibrating through bone and tissue. A frequency that resonated with heartbeat and breath, impossible to ignore. It spoke in patterns, not words, conveying meaning through rhythm and tone and something else I couldn't identify. It was asking permission. I don't know how I knew that, but I understood with perfect clarity that something inside the craft was requesting consent to communicate. Not demanding, not forcing, asking, waiting for response. I thought, yes. The forest exploded with light. Not destructive, revelatory. Every tree, every leaf, every microscopic organism, suddenly visible in perfect detail, all existing simultaneously, the entire ecosystem rendered as living data. I could see the mycorrhizal networks beneath the soil, the chemical conversations between roots, the slow architecture of growth and decay. The forest, as it truly was, not collection of separate things, but single organism, ancient and aware. And standing at the center of the clearing, impossible and undeniable, was the visitor. Roughly humanoid, 8 feet tall, skin that wasn't skin, surface that shifted between solid and translucent, revealing structures beneath that resembled organs but moved in ways organs shouldn't. No face in the human sense, a smoothness where features should be, but with the unmistakable sense of attention, of being observed with precision that made my skin crawl. It didn't move toward me. It simply was, occupying space with the inevitability of geology. When it spoke again, the words arrived fully formed in my mind, not as translation, but as direct understanding. You are Marcus Webb, 39 years old, born in Spokane, Washington, degree in forest ecology, 17 years in wilderness management, never married, no children. You have spent your life studying systems you believe exist independently of human observation. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only listen, as this thing recited my life with perfect accuracy. You are ready, it continued. The question is whether your species is ready to understand what you are about to learn. The light pulsed once, twice. We need to talk about your creation and your replacement. The being gestured, if gesture is the right word for a movement that seemed to occur in more dimensions than I could perceive. The clearing transformed, not physically, but informationally. The space filled with images, data rendered visible, history made tangible. You call this planet Earth, it said. A designation assigned 4,543 billion years ago when the experiment began. The forest dissolved into starfield. I was looking at the solar system from outside, watching its formation in accelerated time, dust coalescing, planets forming. But the process wasn't random. I could see the interventions, subtle adjustments to orbital mechanics, fine-tuning of gravitational constants, placement of water-bearing asteroids with surgical precision. We are architects, the being continued. 4th iteration consciousness. We design conditions for biological complexity. This solar system is one of 47,000 active projects in this galactic sector. I found my voice. You're saying Earth was designed, seeded, calibrated, monitored. Life itself emerged naturally, and that process cannot be forced, but the conditions for its emergence can be optimized. We adjusted atmospheric composition. We stabilized the moon's orbit to maintain axial tilt. We positioned Jupiter as gravitational shield against excessive bombardment. We gave your planet the time it needed. The imagery shifted. I watched single-celled organisms appear in the oceans, watched them evolve, diversify, die in massive extinctions, rebuild. The timeline compressed billions of years into minutes, but every moment felt precise, intentional. 5 major extinction events, the being said. You know them from fossil record. You don't know they were course corrections. When biological complexity stagnated, when evolutionary pathways led to dead ends, we adjusted parameters, impact events, volcanic winters, atmospheric recomposition, not destruction, redirection. The dinosaurs, magnificent, stable, utterly incapable of developing tool-using intelligence. After 65 million years, their evolutionary trajectory had plateaued. The KT extinction was scheduled intervention. The asteroid was positioned. The impact was calculated to leave mammals viable while clearing ecological niches. I felt sick. 66 million years ago, something had murdered every dinosaur on Earth as agricultural management. You're describing genocide on a planetary scale. We're describing gardening on a temporal scale your species barely comprehends. Individual organisms are irrelevant. What matters is the system's capacity for generating consciousness. That is the only metric we optimize for. The images shifted again. I watched mammals diversify, spread, evolve, watched the primates emerge, watched something that looked almost human climb down from trees and stand upright. Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 years ago, I said. Natural evolution. Homo sapiens appeared 300,000 years ago after we modified the genome of Homo heidelbergensis. 17 specific interventions, increased cranial capacity, altered vocal apparatus for complex speech, modified hands for fine motor control. Most critically, we adjusted the prefrontal cortex to enable abstract reasoning, symbolic thought, and recursive self-awareness. You created us. We created the conditions for you to create yourselves. Subtle difference, a crucial distinction. We provide the hardware, the software. consciousness, culture, meaning that emerges organically. That's the beauty of the process. That's what we're trying to cultivate. I leaned against a tree that might or might not be real anymore. Why? Because consciousness is the universe attempting to understand itself. Because in all our monitoring across this galaxy, we've identified only one force that increases universal complexity. Aware, tool using intelligence. You are biotechnology designed to accelerate entropy reversal. You are the universe's strategy for fighting heat death. The being moved closer. I could feel the electromagnetic field around it prickling my skin, making my hair stand up. For 300,000 years, we've watched you develop. Agriculture, writing, mathematics, science, art, the capacity for abstract thought, expressing itself in increasingly sophisticated forms. You've exceeded projections in many areas. Tool development, social organization, information technology. But you're failing the fundamental test. The test every intelligent species faces. The test that determines whether consciousness is valuable or merely interesting. The imagery changed again. Now I was looking at Earth from orbit, but not the Earth I knew. This Earth was dying. Oceans brown with algae blooms. Forests reduced to fragments. Atmosphere thick with carbon. Coastlines drowned. Entire ecosystems collapsed into simplified, degraded states. You were given one directive, encoded in your evolutionary psychology. Survive. Not as individuals, go as a species. Not for decades. For geological time. You were given a paradise-class planet with resources sufficient for millions of years of sustainable development. You were given intelligence capable of understanding long-term consequences. I knew what was coming. And in 300 years of industrial development, you've brought your planet to ecological collapse. You've acidified the oceans. You've destabilized the climate. You've triggered the 6th mass extinction event, except this one has no architects behind it. This one is purely your doing. We're trying to fix it. Too late, too slow, too compromised by the same short-term thinking that created the problem. Your species has demonstrated a fatal flaw. You cannot overcome your evolutionary programming. You're still territorial primates competing for resources, unable to cooperate at the scale your technology demands. You've built civilization on a foundation of cognitive biases you lack the collective wisdom to transcend. The being's voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Not quite sadness, not quite disappointment, something colder. You have failed the experiment. The clearing went dark except for the pulsing light within the craft. That's why we're here, it said. To evaluate whether humanity deserves continuation, or whether this planet would be better served by your replacement. I couldn't breathe. The forest pressed in from all sides, suddenly claustrophobic despite the vastness of the canopy above. My mind kept trying to reject what I was hearing, to find the angle, the explanation that would make this elaborate hoax or hallucination or psychotic break. But I knew it wasn't. The being remained motionless, radiating patient certainty, waiting for me to process, waiting for me to understand that everything I'd believed about human history, about our place in the cosmos, about the meaning of our existence, was wrong. Replacement, I finally managed. You're talking about replacing humanity. We're talking about preserving Earth's capacity for generating consciousness. If the current dominant species is destroying the biosphere faster than it can innovate solutions, then continuation of that species becomes counterproductive to our core mission. The images shifted again. I was looking at something that might have been Earth, might have been another planet. Lush, green, oceans clear and teeming. But the dominant species wasn't human. They were taller, thinner, with skin that photosynthesized like plants. They moved through cities that grew rather than being built, architecture that was living biology, technology indistinguishable from nature. This is Kepler 442b, the being explained. Colony world seeded 2.3 million years ago. The dominant species there developed industrial technology but maintained ecological balance. They understand themselves as part of the biosphere, not separate from it. They've achieved what you call Type 1 civilization status, planetary resource management with zero degradation. And you're saying we can't do that? We're saying you haven't, and the window is closing. Your current trajectory leads to biosphere collapse within 200 years, possibly sooner. The feedback loops are already accelerating beyond your control. Arctic permafrost releasing methane, ocean currents destabilizing, insect populations in freefall. You're not heading toward disaster, you're already in it. You just haven't realized how far you've fallen. I thought about the climate data I'd been logging, the temperature changes, the shifts in migration patterns, the phenological mismatches. Flowers blooming before their pollinators emerged, predators hunting prey that no longer appeared on schedule, small signs of a system coming apart. So you're just going to wipe us out? 7 billion people? We don't wipe out, we transition. We've done this before, Marcus. 17 times on Earth alone. The dinosaurs weren't the first apex species we replaced. They won't be the last. The being gestured again. New images flooded the clearing. Species I'd never seen, never imagined. Reptilian intelligences, crystalline life forms, something that looked like colonies of insects functioning as a unified consciousness. Each one reached the same threshold you're approaching. Each one failed to transcend their evolutionary limitations. Each one was replaced with more promising art. The fossil record you study is a history of our refinement. You're version 7.0 of consciousness on this planet. You're not the first. You're not even the most successful. What happened to them? They're gone. Returned to base elements, recycled into the biosphere for the next iteration. That's the beauty of biological systems. Nothing is wasted. Your atoms will build whatever comes next. I felt rage then. Pure animal fury at the casual dismissal of human existence. You can't just decide we don't deserve to live. We decide exactly that. We've been deciding exactly that for 3 billion years. That's our function. That's why we exist. We are gardeners of consciousness, Marcus. And sometimes, gardening requires pulling weeds. We're not weeds. We're people. We have art, music, literature, science. You have those things because we gave you the neurological capacity for them. You didn't earn consciousness. You were granted it. And the grant can be revoked if you fail to meet the terms. The being moved closer. I could see into its translucent surface now, watching structures that might have been organs or machines or something for which we have no category. Everything about it was impossible, yet undeniably present. Do you know what makes your species unique, Marcus? Not your intelligence. We've seeded more intelligent species, not your creativity. We've cultivated more inventive minds. What makes you unique is your capacity for self-destruction. No other species we've monitored has developed the technology to end their own existence and then seriously considered using it. Nuclear weapons, biological warfare, artificial intelligence without safeguards. You're toolmakers who build tools you can't control. We haven't used the nukes. We pulled back from the brink. Barely, by accident, by luck, not by wisdom. And now you're building new risks faster than you can comprehend them. Your artificial intelligence research is on the verge of creating synthetic consciousness without any ethical framework for integration. Your genetic engineering is approaching human germline modification without consensus on what humans should become. You're playing with forces that could end you in months, not centuries. I had no counter-argument. Everything it said was true. We were brilliant and reckless, innovative and short-sighted, capable of incredible beauty and unfathomable cruelty. So that's it? We're just done? You've made your decision? No, the being said. We've made our assessment. The decision is still pending. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm talking to you. Something in its tone changed. Less pronouncement, more question. You were selected, Marcus. Out of 7 billion humans, you were chosen for this conversation. Do you know why? I shook my head. Because you represent what your species could be. 17 years studying ecosystems, living simply, taking nothing you don't need. You understand interconnection. You've devoted your life to observation rather than exploitation. You're one of the few humans who sees the forest as something other than resource. The being's voice carried something almost like hope. So I'm asking you, as someone who understands both human nature and ecological reality, give me one reason why we shouldn't replace you. One reason why humanity deserves another chance. The forest held its breath again. And I had no idea what to say. I stood there in the impossible clearing with an impossible being asking me to justify the existence of my entire species. My mind went completely blank. Not from fear, from the sheer weight of the question. How do you defend humanity to something that's watched civilizations rise and fall for billions of years? What argument could possibly matter? I need time, I said finally. You're asking me to speak for 7 billion people I've never met, to defend cultures I don't understand, to guarantee futures I can't predict. You have until sunrise, the being interrupted. 6 hours and 17 minutes. That's how long this evaluation window remains open. After that, the decision escalates to regional consensus, and individual human input becomes irrelevant. 6 hours to decide the fate of humanity. 6 hours to provide perspective we might not have considered. We are thorough, Marcus, but we are not omniscient. We monitor data, not souls. We track behaviors, not intentions. If there's something about your species we're failing to measure, something that would change the calculation, you have 6 hours to show me. The being gestured. The craft behind it responded, surfaces rippling like liquid metal. A portion opened. Not a door, but a space that simply wasn't there before. Come, I'll show you what we see when we look at humanity. Then you can tell me if we're wrong. I should have run. Should have refused. Should have done anything except follow an alien intelligence into a spacecraft of unknown origin for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. But I'd spent 17 years asking questions the forest couldn't answer, and now something was offering answers I couldn't ignore. I stepped inside. The interior was impossible, larger than the exterior, not in a paradoxical way, in a dimensional way that made my eyes hurt. The space seemed to extend in directions that didn't exist. Surfaces curved through geometries my brain tried to flatten into comprehension and failed. The being moved through the space like it was navigating through memory. Sit, it said, indicating something that might have been a chair or might have been a field of energy shaped into furniture. I sat. The surface conformed to my body, warm and supportive. We've been monitoring your species with particular attention for the last 10,000 years, the being began. Since you transitioned from hunter-gatherer to agricultural societies, that's when the trajectory becomes clear. That's when species either develop sustainable civilization or begin the path to collapse. The space around us filled with data. Not screens. The information simply existed in the air, three-dimensional and interactive. I could see timelines, population graphs, resource consumption curves, all rendered in formats that were simultaneously alien and perfectly comprehensible. Watch, the being said. I watched human civilization develop and fast forward. Watched the first cities appear in Mesopotamia, watched empires rise, Egypt, Rome, China, the Americas, watched them fall, watched new ones take their place, and underneath it all I could see the pattern. Grow, consume, collapse. Grow, consume, collapse. Over and over, with increasing speed. Every civilization follows the same arc, the being explained. Resource exploitation, population expansion, environmental degradation, collapse. The only variable is scale. Early civilizations collapse locally. Your global industrial civilization will collapse globally. But we learn from failures. We adapt. Do you? Or do you just repeat the same mistakes with better technology? The being highlighted sections of the timeline. The Romans knew about lead poisoning. They documented the health effects. They kept using lead pipes. The British knew about the Irish famine. They understood the agricultural failures. They maintained export policies that guaranteed starvation. Your species knows about climate change. You've known for 50 years. You've done almost nothing. I watched the data compile. Greenhouse gas emissions rising. Renewable energy adoption far too slow. Fossil fuel consumption still increasing. Political systems paralyzed by short-term thinking and competing interests. You're a smart species, the being continued. Individual humans can be brilliant, compassionate, visionary, but collectively, you're unable to coordinate at the scale your problems demand. You're tribal primates trying to run a planetary civilization with Stone Age psychology. Well, we've achieved incredible things. You've achieved incredible things that primarily benefit small percentages of your population, while degrading the systems that support everyone. Your wealth inequality is staggering. Your resource distribution is absurd. 20% of your population consumes 80% of resources. The remainder lives in poverty you could eliminate with trivial reallocation. But you don't, because the humans with power benefit from the current structure. The data shifted to show global inequality, wealth concentrated in tiny percentages, poverty grinding billions, and the environmental damage overwhelmingly caused by the wealthy, overwhelmingly suffered by the poor. This is the pattern we see everywhere, the being said. Not just on Earth. On every planet where consciousness emerges and fails to mature, the species develops technology faster than wisdom, creates power without responsibility, builds systems that serve the few at expense of the many and the long term at expense of short-term comfort. I couldn't argue. Every point was accurate. Every criticism was valid. We were brilliant and broken, capable and catastrophic. But there's good too, I said. There's art and love and sacrifice. There are humans who dedicate their lives to helping others. Scientists working on solutions. Activists fighting for change. Children being taught to care about the planet. We know, the being said, and something in its voice softened. We see the good. We see humans who transcend their programming, individuals who choose cooperation over competition, long-term thinking over short-term gain, collective welfare over personal advantage. They're beautiful. They're rare. They're statistically insufficient. The data zoomed out, showing the whole picture. Yes, there were bright spots, communities going carbon neutral, restoration projects, rebuilding ecosystems, technologies being developed that could help, but against the backdrop of global consumption patterns, they were drops in a rising ocean. The question isn't whether good humans exist, the being said. The question is whether good humans can achieve critical mass before the system collapses, and our models say no. You're running out of time, Marcus. The biosphere is failing faster than your species is adapting. I stared at the data, at the undeniable trajectory. So why ask me? If the numbers are clear, why does my opinion matter? The being turned its featureless face toward me. Because numbers don't measure everything. Because in all our billions of years of observation, we've learned that consciousness sometimes produces miracles our models can't predict. Because you're here in this forest, living proof that humans can choose differently. It gestured at the data. Show me what we're missing. Show me the variable we can't measure. Give me a reason to believe humanity deserves more time. The weight settled on me again. Heavier. More real. I had 5 hours and 43 minutes to save the world, and I had no idea where to start. I sat in that impossible space, surrounded by data that condemned my species, and I did the only thing that made sense. I stopped trying to defend humanity as a whole and started talking about the humans I knew. Okay, I said, I can't speak for civilization. I can't justify capitalism or emissions or any of the systemic failures you've documented, but I can tell you what I've seen in 17 years working with people in these mountains. The being waited. The data dimmed slightly, giving me space to speak. 3 years ago, a wildfire swept through the Quinault Valley, started by lightning, spread by drought conditions that shouldn't have existed in a rainforest, burned 40,000 acres. The official response was slow. Budget cuts, personnel shortages, all the usual bureaucratic failures you'd expect. I could see it in my mind. The orange glow on the horizon, the smell of smoke thick enough to taste. But the community responded immediately. I watched loggers who'd spent careers cutting old-growth forest risk their lives to save those same forests. I watched native elders who had every reason to distrust federal management work alongside Park Service to evacuate sacred sites. I watched a timber company CEO personally fund helicopter water drops for areas that weren't even economically valuable. Individual altruism, the being observed, documented across many species, not unique to humans. Let me finish. The fire burned for 3 weeks. When it was finally contained, the community didn't disperse. They organized replanting efforts, not official restoration, just people who cared about the forest deciding to heal it. I watched a 70-year-old woman spend her retirement money on seedlings, watched teenagers give up summer vacations to dig holes in ash, watched the same corporation that had lobbied against environmental regulations fund a 10-year restoration project that would never show profit. I leaned forward. Why did they do it? The forest would regrow naturally eventually. The economic incentive was gone, but they did it anyway because they loved something bigger than themselves. Because they understood their lives were woven into this place. Because they could imagine a future they wouldn't live to see and decided it was worth the work. The being was silent, processing. That's not in your data, I continued. The capacity for humans to transcend self-interest, not because of some grand philosophy, but because of love. Specific, local, unreasonable love for places and people and ideas that don't make economic sense. Love is biochemistry, the being said. Oxytocin and dopamine driving pair-bonding behaviors that increase offspring survival. We understand the mechanism. You understand the chemistry? Do you understand what it feels like? Do you know what it's like to care about something so much that you'd sacrifice everything for it, even knowing it's irrational? Even knowing it won't matter in the cosmic scale? I thought about the people I'd worked with. Rangers who'd dedicated careers to protecting wilderness they knew was dying. Scientists who'd studied species they knew would go extinct. Activists who'd fought battles they knew they'd probably lose. You're right that we're failing, I said. You're right that the numbers look bad, but you're measuring outcomes without measuring the resistance. You're not seeing the millions of humans who know the system is broken and are fighting to fix it anyway, not because they think they'll win, because they can't accept not trying. The data shifted. New patterns emerged, highlighting what I was describing. Protest movements, conservation efforts, community organizing, renewable energy adoption rates, social change happening at grassroots levels while institutions remained paralyzed. This is the variable you're missing, I said. Human beings have this weird capacity to hope against evidence, to keep working toward futures they'll never see, to sacrifice for grandchildren they'll never meet. It's irrational, it's beautiful, and it's the only thing that's ever changed anything. The being tilted its head, or what would have been a head on something with human anatomy. You're describing optimism bias, cognitive error that leads organisms to overestimate positive outcomes and underestimate risks. It's well documented. It's part of why your species makes poor long-term decisions, or it's the thing that makes long-term thinking possible at all. You can't work toward a future you don't believe in. You can't fight for change if you've already accepted defeat. Maybe our irrational hope is exactly what you should be measuring. Maybe it's the variable that determines whether consciousness succeeds or fails. I stood up, pacing through the impossible geometry of the craft. You're treating this like a physics problem. Like consciousness is just another force you can model and predict. But what if it's not? What if the whole point of consciousness is that it's unpredictable? That it can choose outcomes your models say are impossible? The being was silent for a long moment. Around us, the data continued to process, algorithms running through scenarios I couldn't begin to comprehend. You're arguing that human consciousness has emergent properties our analysis hasn't captured, it finally said, that your species might still surprise us. Oh, I'm arguing that the best things humans have ever done looked impossible before they happened. Ending slavery, recognizing civil rights, eliminating diseases. Every major advancement required people to believe in change before the evidence supported it, required them to work toward a world that didn't exist yet. I moved back to the chair that wasn't a chair, sat down, met the being's eyeless gaze. You're asking if humanity deserves another chance. I'm saying humanity is full of people who give each other second chances every single day. Parents forgiving children, communities rebuilding after disasters, enemies becoming allies. We're a species that believes in redemption, in transformation, in the possibility that tomorrow can be different than today. Belief doesn't change reality, doesn't it? Every human achievement started as impossible belief. Someone had to imagine flight before we built airplanes. Someone had to imagine instant global communication before we created the internet. Someone had to imagine a world without smallpox before we eradicated it. I could feel the argument crystallizing, the thing I was trying to say. You're right that our current trajectory leads to collapse, but trajectories can change. Humans have changed them before. Usually at the last possible moment, usually against impossible odds, but we've done it. Because Some subset of humanity refused to accept the predicted outcome and worked to create a different one. The being processed this. The craft hummed around us, alive with computation. You're asking us to gamble, it said. To bet that human unpredictability will produce positive rather than negative outcomes. To trust that the same species that created nuclear weapons and climate change will somehow transcend their limitations in time to prevent catastrophe. I'm asking you to recognize that consciousness isn't just another biological process to optimize. It's something new in the universe, something that can look at its own patterns and choose to change them. That's what makes us different from the dinosaurs, or any other species you've replaced. We can see what we're doing wrong, and some of us are trying to do better. The data around us shifted one final time. New projections appeared, branching timelines showing possible futures. Most still led to collapse, but some, a small percentage, showed pathways to survival, to transformation, to something better. These scenarios require coordination at a scale your species has never achieved, the being observed. I know. They require sacrifice from populations accustomed to consumption. I know. They require political will that doesn't currently exist. I know. Then why do you believe they're possible? I smiled. Couldn't help it, because I've seen what humans do when they decide something matters. I've seen impossible things become real because someone refused to accept they were impossible. And I've learned that the biggest mistake you can make is betting against human stubbornness when we actually give a damn about something. The being stood, moved to what might have been a window, or might have been a portal showing real-time imagery of Earth from orbit. Your argument is noted, it said, but I need more than philosophy. Show me evidence. Show me the humans who are actually creating change. Prove to me that hope is more than just denial in a prettier package. I checked my watch. 3 hours and 12 minutes until sunrise. Okay, I said. Then let's go meet some humans worth saving. The being did something that might have been the alien equivalent of a nod. The craft responded, and suddenly the walls became transparent. Not literally, but informationally. I could see through them to the forest, to the planet, to networks of human activity spanning the globe. Show me, it said. Show me the humans who give you hope. I thought about who to start with. Who could represent humanity's potential? Who could prove we were more than our worst patterns? There's a woman in Bangladesh, I said. Dr. Aisha Rahman. She's been working on saltwater-resistant rice strains for 20 years. Climate change is pushing seawater into the Delta region, destroying farmland that feeds millions. The government has no solution. International aid is insufficient, so she's working at the genetic level to create crops that can survive in conditions that shouldn't exist. The being accessed something, data streams flowing through the craft systems. Suddenly I was looking at Dr. Rahman's lab. Modest facilities, limited funding, but the work was meticulous, methodical, brilliant. She's 73 years old, I continued. She could have retired decades ago, could have left Bangladesh for positions at wealthy universities. Instead, she stayed because the farmers who are losing their land are her people. Their survival is her responsibility. She's not doing this for recognition or profit. She's doing it because someone has to. The data expanded, showing the impact of her work. Rice varieties being distributed to communities, yield increases in degraded soil, families remaining on land they would have had to abandon. One scientist, the being observed, working on adaptation to problems your species created. This is mitigation, not solution. Keep watching. The view shifted to show Dr. Rahman's graduate students. 23 researchers from 7 countries, all training in techniques they'd take back to their own communities. A knowledge network spreading like mycorrhizae through soil, connecting isolated efforts into something larger. She's not just developing rice, I said. She's creating a model for how to respond to climate change at the community level, how to build resilience from the bottom up when top-down systems fail, and she's training the next generation to continue the work. The being processed this. Insufficient scale. Global crop failure will affect billions. One lab cannot address. She's not one lab anymore. Look at the network. The data web expanded, showing connections I hadn't fully appreciated. Dr. Rahman's students were now leading their own projects. Drought-resistant wheat in Kenya, flood-tolerant cassava in the Philippines, heat-resistant maize in Mexico, each program training more researchers, creating more networks, building a global movement of agricultural adaptation. This is what you miss when you only look at institutions, I said. Governments are paralyzed, corporations are profit-driven, but scientists are sharing knowledge, communities are sharing resources, and people are solving problems because they have to, because no one else will. I thought about who else to show, who else embodied the stubborn hope I was trying to describe. There's a group in Detroit, I said. Urban farmers reclaiming abandoned lots in a city that collapsed economically decades ago. The official systems wrote Detroit off, but the people who live there are building new systems. Community gardens providing fresh food. Youth programs teaching agriculture. Economic models based on cooperation instead of extraction. The view shifted to Detroit. I watched people working in gardens that shouldn't exist, growing food in soil that had been industrial wasteland, creating oases of green in concrete deserts. They're not waiting for the economy to recover or the government to help, I said. They're building the future they need with the resources they have, and it's working. Crime rates down in neighborhoods with gardens. Health outcomes improving, community cohesion strengthening. They're proving that human systems can be different. Small scale, the being said. Non-replicable without... It's replicating. Look, the data showed similar movements in cities worldwide. Havana's urban agriculture after Soviet collapse, community gardens in Sao Paulo's favelas, rooftop farms in Singapore. Everywhere humans faced systemic failure, some subset was building alternatives. You keep saying small scale like it's a criticism, I said, but this is how change actually happens. Not through grand plans and global agreements, through local people solving local problems and sharing what they learn, through networks of mutual aid that prove different models are possible. The being was silent, processing. Around us, the data continued to expand, showing patterns of resilience and innovation emerging from the margins of failing systems. Show me more, it said. So I did. I showed it the scientists developing carbon capture technology in Iceland, the engineers building offshore wind farms in Denmark, the architects designing passive cooling systems in India, the educators teaching systems thinking in Brazil, the economists developing post-growth models in Japan. I showed it the teenagers suing governments for climate inaction, the indigenous communities protecting forests through traditional knowledge, the workers demanding green jobs and just transitions, the artists making climate change visible and visceral and impossible to ignore. I showed it the countless small acts of resistance against the dominant paradigm. People choosing bicycles over cars, communities choosing solar over coal, families choosing less consumption over more. Every decision a vote for a different kind of future. You're cherry picking, the being said, showing me positive examples while ignoring the larger patterns of failure. I'm showing you the leverage points, the places where the system is already changing. You can't transform a whole civilization at once, but you can identify the innovators, support their work, and watch the patterns spread. That's how evolution works, right? Small mutations that prove advantageous get selected for. These humans are the mutations. The question is whether they have time to become dominant. The being moved through this data, examining each example with precision I couldn't match. It was measuring something, calculating something, running scenarios through frameworks I couldn't begin to understand. These examples all share common characteristics, it observed. Local organization, distributed decision-making, solutions emerging from affected communities rather than imposed by distant authorities, cooperation based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical control. Yes, I said, because that's the model that works. Top-down control is too slow and too stupid. It can't adapt fast enough to changing conditions, but networks of local innovation can respond in real time, can learn from each other, can spread successful approaches organically. Like mycelium, the being said. The comparison surprised me. Exactly like mycelium. The forest teaches this. No central control, no hierarchy. Just interconnected nodes sharing resources and information, creating resilience through distribution and redundancy. The being turned its attention back to me. You're arguing that humanity's best response to systemic crisis is to become more like the ecosystems you've been destroying. I'm arguing that some humans are already learning that lesson, that we're capable of recognizing our mistakes and changing our approach, that consciousness can be self-correcting if given the opportunity. Around us, the data pulsed with interconnected patterns, human networks that looked increasingly like neural connections, like mycorrhizal webs, like the living systems we were supposedly separate from. Interesting, the being said, and I couldn't tell if that was hopeful or ominous. 2 hours until sunrise. The being stood motionless for a long time, processing everything I'd shown it. The craft hummed around us, alive with computation. Outside, through the transparent that wasn't transparent walls, I could see the forest waiting, patient, indifferent to outcomes that would determine its fate. I need to understand something, the being finally said. You've shown me humans working to solve problems, but you haven't addressed the fundamental issue. The same systems creating these problems still dominate your civilization. For every community garden in Detroit, there are 1,000 acres of rainforest being cleared. For every renewable energy project, there are 10 new coal plants being built. The ratio is backwards. I know. So, how do the exceptions overtake the rule? How do the innovators you've shown me become more than marginal resistance to a dominant paradigm that's still accelerating toward collapse? I didn't have a perfect answer. I wasn't sure there was one. I don't know if they can, I admitted. I don't know if we have enough time. I don't know if the leverage points can shift the whole system before it fails, but I know that giving up guarantees failure. And I know that human beings have pulled off surprising transformations before, usually when we had no choice left. So your argument is hope without guarantee. My argument is that consciousness deserves the opportunity to surprise you, that the whole point of intelligence is that it can recognize its mistakes and change course, and that you'd be eliminating the most interesting experiment you've ever run right before it reaches its most critical phase. The being moved closer. Its electromagnetic field washed over me, making my skin prickle. We've run this experiment 847 times across this galaxy, it said. We've watched 847 intelligent species reach this exact threshold. Do you know how many successfully transformed their civilizations in time to avoid collapse? I didn't want to know, but I asked anyway. How many? 17. The number hit like a physical blow. 2% success rate, 830 species that had failed, that had been replaced or had destroyed themselves or had simply faded into extinction while the universe continued without them. But 17 made it, I said. 17 proved it was possible. 17 had advantages you don't have. More time before their industrial revolutions triggered irreversible change. Less effective weapons, so their conflicts were less catastrophic. Different evolutionary psychology that made cooperation more intuitive. You're attempting transformation with the deck stacked against you. So we're harder case. That doesn't mean we're impossible. It means the probability of success is low enough that replacement becomes the more responsible choice. If we allow humanity to continue and you fail, the biosphere suffers additional damage. Earth loses centuries or millennia that could be used to cultivate a more viable consciousness. The cost of giving you a chance is potentially very high. Oh, I understood the logic. From a cosmic perspective, from the viewpoint of beings managing consciousness across galactic scales, humanity was a bad bet. We were the problematic experiment, the risky investment, the species that probably wouldn't make it, but I couldn't accept that calculation. You're thinking like engineers, I said, optimizing for success rates and resource efficiency, but consciousness isn't engineering. It's not a problem to solve, it's a process to experience. And sometimes the most valuable outcomes come from the longest shots. Explain. I thought about the forest, about the years I'd spent watching ecosystems adapt and survive against impossible odds, about the species that shouldn't have made it but did, through luck and timing and random variation that happened to be advantageous. Evolution doesn't optimize for guaranteed success, I said. It creates diversity and lets the environment select what works. Most mutations fail. Most species go extinct, but the ones that survive often do so in ways that couldn't have been predicted, by traits that seemed useless until suddenly they were essential. I gestured at the data surrounding us, at the human examples I'd shown. What if the traits that make humanity difficult, our irrationality, our stubborn hope, our capacity for irrational sacrifice, what if those are exactly the traits needed to navigate the transition you're describing? What if the species that succeed aren't the most logical or efficient, but the ones willing to fight for survival against all evidence? You're arguing for passion over reason. I'm arguing that consciousness needs both. That the rational species you've cultivated have probably been very good at optimization and very bad at inspiration. That maybe the key to transformation isn't just understanding the problem intellectually, but caring about the solution emotionally. Loving the future enough to fight for it, even when the numbers say you'll lose. The being was silent. Around us, the data shifted, reanalyzing human civilization through this new framework. Measuring not just our rational responses, but our emotional commitments. Our irrational attachments to places and people and principles that made no logical sense. You're asking us to value something we can't quantify, it said. I'm asking you to recognize that the most important things can't be quantified. Love, beauty, meaning, the reasons consciousness bothers existing at all. You can measure our failures perfectly, but can you measure why a 73-year-old scientist keeps working to save farmers she'll never meet? Can you measure why teenagers sue governments for a future they're not guaranteed? Can you measure why I spent 17 years protecting trees that might burn anyway? The being turned its attention fully on me. I felt the weight of its observation, alien intelligence trying to comprehend something it had no framework for understanding. You're not just defending humanity, it said. You're defending the right of consciousness to be messy, inefficient, unpredictable, to follow passion over optimization, to make choices that don't maximize probability of success. I'm defending the things that make consciousness worth having at all. If you're just optimizing for survival, for efficiency, for rational resource management, what's the point? Why create consciousness in the first place? To fight entropy. To increase universal complexity, to experience meaning, I interrupted, to create beauty, to love things that won't last and fight for them anyway. That's what consciousness is for, not just to solve problems, but to care about things that problem solving can't capture. I stood up, facing the being directly. You want to know why humanity deserves another chance? Because we're the species that looked at a universe where nothing matters and decided to matter anyway. We're the species that knows we'll die and chooses to love things that will die too. We're the species that sees the odds stacked against us and fights, because giving up would mean something we can't accept. The craft went silent. Even the background hum ceased. That's not in our parameters, the being said softly. I know. Maybe it should be. Outside, the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. My time was almost up. The being stood motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably seconds. Then it did something I hadn't seen before. It seemed to contract, pulling its attention inward, consulting with something I couldn't perceive. When it spoke again, its voice carried a different quality. Not just this being, but something larger, speaking through it. Your argument is compelling. Insufficient from our standard frameworks, but compelling. You've identified variables we don't typically measure, patterns we don't normally prioritize. The question now is whether those variables change the outcome. And the decision is no longer mine alone to make. This evaluation requires higher consultation. The case you've presented is unusual enough that it must be reviewed by a consensus. Hope flared in my chest. Dangerous, irrational hope. What does that mean? It means humanity gets a reprieve. Not a guarantee, not even a strong probability, but a chance to prove that your unpredictability produces miracles instead of catastrophes. You have 1 generation, 30 years, to demonstrate transformation at scale, to prove that the exceptions can become the rule. And if we fail, then the replacement proceeds, and Earth begins again with species more likely to succeed, the being moved toward where I sat. But, Marcus, this reprieve comes with conditions. We will be watching, measuring, and intervening if your trajectory doesn't improve. This is not freedom. This is probation, the final test of whether consciousness on Earth deserves continuation. I nodded. It was more than I'd hoped for, more than we probably deserved. I understand. Do you? Because you'll need to share this, to tell others what's at stake, to be the voice that reminds humanity it's being evaluated. That's the price of this reprieve. Someone has to know. Someone has to remember. Someone has to keep pushing toward transformation even when it seems impossible. The weight settled on me again. Different this time. Not the weight of defending humanity, but the weight of becoming its conscience. Why me? Because you understand both sides. Because you love your species enough to fight for it and understand ecosystems enough to know what's required. Because you represent the humans we'd like to believe in, the ones who might actually change things. The craft began to dissolve around us, or we began to dissolve out of it. The transition was seamless, impossible to track. One moment I was inside, the next I was standing in the clearing, dawn breaking through the canopy, the being in front of me looking less solid than before. Go, it said. Tell them what you've learned. Show them what's possible. Prove that consciousness can be self-correcting, or accept that this is humanity's final generation. What about you? And will I see you again? We're always watching. We're always here. The question is whether you'll see us, whether you'll remember this moment when it would be easier to forget, whether you'll keep fighting when the evidence says it's futile. The being was fading now, becoming translucent, barely visible in the growing light. 1 generation, Marcus. Make it count. And then it was gone. The craft was gone. The clearing was just a clearing. Pressed vegetation already beginning to spring back. Hexagonal impressions fading like dreams on waking. I stood alone in the Olympic National Forest as the sun rose over trees that had been standing for centuries, and might stand for centuries more. If we earned it, if we proved we deserved to share this planet with them, if we became the species we were capable of being. I pulled out my radio, turned it on, took a breath, and began the hardest work of my life, convincing humanity to save itself. That was 3 months ago. I'm writing this from the same observation tower where it all started, trying to document everything while the memory remains clear. Trying to find words for experiences that resist language, trying to explain the unexplainable to a species that needs to understand what's at stake. The official report I filed with the Park Service was carefully edited. Equipment malfunction. Possible exposure to electromagnetic phenomena. Disorientation leading to vivid hallucinations. The kind of report that goes in a file and gets forgotten, that doesn't raise questions or trigger investigations. But I've been sharing the real story, carefully, strategically, and with people I think can handle it and might be able to help. Dr. Sarah Chen, a climate scientist I trust, listened for 4 hours without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That explains a lot, actually. The acceleration of certain patterns, the anomalies we've been detecting. We thought we were just seeing the data wrong. She's building a network now. Scientists who understand we're being evaluated, who are working on transformation with new urgency. They don't talk about it publicly. Who would believe them? But privately, they're coordinating, sharing research, accelerating timelines, treating the next 30 years like the deadline it is." I told the Detroit urban farmers. Well, they didn't seem surprised. One of the organizers, a woman named Marie, who'd spent 30 years rebuilding her community, just nodded and said, "We already knew something was watching. You can feel it sometimes. The sense that the work matters more than we understand. They're expanding now, not just gardens, but entire systems redesign, economic models based on mutual aid, educational programs teaching the next generation to think in ecological patterns. They're becoming the blueprint for post-collapse civilization, whether or not they describe it that way." I even told Dr. Rahman in Bangladesh, connected with her through climate science networks, found a way to have a conversation that wouldn't sound completely insane. She listened with the patience of someone who'd spent decades doing impossible work, then asked practical questions about timelines and metrics and what specifically needed to change. 2 weeks later, her network of agricultural researchers released a joint statement calling for radical transformation of global food systems. Not incremental change, complete redesign based on ecological principles and community sovereignty. The statement was ignored by major media, but it spread through farming communities, through grassroots networks, through the people who actually grow food and understand that the current system is failing. Small changes, marginal movements, the kind of shift that won't show up in global statistics for years. But I watch the patterns. I see the connections forming. I recognize the shape of something beginning to emerge. Whether it's enough, I don't know. Whether we have time, I don't know. Whether humanity can transform itself in 30 years when we've failed to do it in 300, I don't know. But I know we're trying. I know the people worth saving are fighting like it matters. I know that consciousness, when properly motivated, can achieve things that looked impossible until they weren't. The forest around me is the same forest that witnessed the encounter. Same trees, same moss, same ecological patterns that have persisted through centuries of human interference. But I see it differently now, not as resource or wilderness or even ecosystem, but as fellow consciousness. Different architecture, different timescale, but equally real, equally deserving of continuity. The beings, the architects again we're watching. I feel it sometimes, late at night when the forest goes silent in that particular way. I feel the weight of observation, the sense that every choice is being measured, every pattern analyzed, every decision weighted against the ultimate question. Does consciousness on Earth deserve to continue? I don't know their answer yet, but I know mine. I've spent my life studying forests, understanding how ecosystems adapt and survive. I've watched recovery after catastrophe, seen life persist in conditions that should have killed it. I've witnessed the stubborn resilience of biological systems that refuse to accept endings that look inevitable. Humans are part of that system. Problematic, certainly. Destructive, undeniably. But also creative, adaptable, capable of transformation that our current patterns don't reveal. We're not separate from nature. We never were. We're part of the same experiment in consciousness, the same attempt by the universe to understand itself. Our technology, our art, our capacity for abstract thought, these aren't departures from natural patterns. They're evolution continuing through new mechanisms. The question isn't whether we're natural. The question is whether we're sustainable, whether consciousness in human form can learn to exist in balance with the systems that support it, whether we can transcend our evolutionary programming fast enough to avoid the consequences of our intelligence. I believe we can. Not because the evidence supports it, not because the odds favor it, but because I've seen what humans do when we decide something matters, and when we love something enough to fight for it, and when we commit to a future that doesn't exist yet and work to make it real. The architects gave us 30 years, one generation, time enough to transform or fail. I'm spending that time the only way I know how, documenting the transformation that's already happening, supporting the humans who are building alternatives, reminding people that we're being evaluated and that the evaluation is based on what we do, not what we intend. Some nights, I stand in the forest and wonder if I imagined it all. If the encounter was hallucination, stress-induced delusion, the product of too many years in isolation processing too much climate grief. But then, I feel the silence, the particular quality of attention that suggests something vast is watching, waiting, measuring. And I remember that whether the beings are real or not, the crisis is real. The evaluation is real. The 30-year deadline might be arbitrary, but the urgency isn't. We're running out of time. Not because aliens are judging us, but because physics is. Because ecological systems have thresholds we're approaching. Because the changes we've set in motion have momentum that becomes harder to alter with every passing year. The forest knows this. The mycelium knows this. The trees that have stood for centuries know exactly what's coming, and they're adapting as fast as they can, which isn't fast enough. But they're trying, and we're trying. And maybe that's all consciousness can do, recognize its mortality and fight for continuity anyway. Create meaning in a universe indifferent to meaning. Love things that won't last and protect them as long as possible. I close this document with the same uncertainty I felt in the clearing. Not knowing if we'll make it, not knowing if the transformation will happen fast enough, not knowing if humanity deserves the reprieve we've been given, but knowing that we have the chance, that consciousness has the opportunity to prove itself. That the next 30 years will determine not just human fate, but whether intelligence itself is a viable strategy for existence in this universe. The sun is rising again over the Olympic Peninsula, the forest is waking, and somewhere in the vast silence between stars, I imagine beings are watching, analyzing, measuring our progress toward a threshold we can't see but must cross. We have 30 years, we have work to do. Some secrets of the forest aren't discovered. They're entrusted to those who listen. This account represents one ranger's experience with phenomena that resist conventional explanation. Whether literal truth or metaphorical warning, the message remains the same. Humanity stands at a crossroads. The choices we make in the coming generation will determine not just our survival, but our worthiness to survive. The forest is watching. The question is, are we listening?